to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Texas versus Michigan week 2, which ultimately I think is the most exciting game going into week 2. And, there is a lot to digest here, but ultimately, I'm particularly excited for this because this is the last matchup that they had was back in 2005 in the Rose Bowl. So it's pretty much been about 20 years since we've seen this matchup. And I think the one thing that's been really exciting, despite all the conference realignment and the NIL and all the changes, is that a lot of the out of conference games have been particularly fascinating and exciting to watch, especially, when you think about USC versus LSU, and then even some of the smaller schools too. You really get some interesting dynamics there because you don't really imagine a lot of these schools playing each other with the amount of traveling you have to do and all that. Like, for example, UCLA versus Hawaii, I don't think a lot of people would have really thought to see, and all of that good stuff too. But going into this game, my I think what really is going to win or lose this game is I think it's going to come down to the trenches because what we saw last year from Michigan was that a lot of their offense with Blake Corum and all of the with Blake Corum and JJ McCarthy and all those guys was they were ultimately able to control the line of scrimmage. They were able to run the ball down people's throats and control the time of possession, which I do think if they have any shot at beating Texas, which at the moment I really do think Texas will resoundingly win this game, is they're just gonna have to control that line of scrimmage way better than what we saw versus Fresno State. Now, obviously, I'll be the first one to admit I was flipping. I got the YouTube TV thing where you can do the four screen, but I was going around between UCLA versus Hawaii. I had Notre Dame and Texas A&M. I had UCLA and Hawaii, and then at the very end too, I also had Alabama and Western Kentucky going on too. But in any event, when I really had that game on, there were a couple things that really came to mind. I think first and foremost that I think I definitely anticipated this to some degree because obviously Sharon Moore is really the only legitimate candidate that could take over for Jim Harbaugh, giving the sanctions that were going on, and it just really made a lot more sense to kind of promote from within compared to going outside and worry about a bunch of your players ultimately transferring too. So when you already have that nucleus in there, it makes a lot more sense to give them the opportunity to, especially when as the interim coach, he did a hell of a job too. So it makes all the sense in the world for him to get another chance. But I think I would imagine this would be echoed on other college football shows too, such as Josh Pate or you know or Joel Klatt or whoever you watch. But I just it was very I was a little disappointed watching Michigan's offense kind of really get the ball going because you know right now they're kind of in this sort of struggle where you have this inspiring story of Davis Warren, who was a walk on. He had leukemia back in 2019. He fought back and now is ultimately the starter. But you also do have another quarterback in Alex Ojai, who is that dynamic running threat and kind of reminds you of you know Daryl Robinson. Yeah, I think his name's Daryl Robinson. Yeah, who was there back in the early 2010s, where he does have that balance of being able to run that RPO and those read options and those speed options, where you know as much as Michigan does like to kind of go in the trenches and ultimately dominate that sort of center, they're also able to kind of get on the outside too and run zones and run spreads and do all that good stuff too. But I think what was missing from the Fresno State game was they didn't control the tempo of the game. As much, I'm not, I did a segment on Fresno State earlier when I was talking about Jeff Tedford, who had to step away. So I think a lot of people sort of expected, that game to kind of be, you know, sort of a showcase for, how much Michigan has changed in terms of their offensive structure. and all that good stuff. But I really saw a team that looked like they're going to have some growing pains. And going into this Texas game, yes, they do have that home field advantage, and yes, they do kind of they are going to figure it out. But I think what we're going to see ultimately play out is there's a lot more new faces on that offensive line that I think are going to be I think are going to be sort of taken advantage of in terms of that offensive line. Now, yes, you don't have to deal with you don't have to deal with Devontae Sweat, and you don't have to deal with Byron Murphy, who both went to the NFL. But at the same time, Coach Stark and all of those guys are constantly recruiting, and they're no matter what, they're going to have those. That Texas front is always going to be dominant no matter what. And I just right now, when I watch this game, I really don't see how they can kind of outplay that too, because I think for starters, no matter how you kind of go into this game, I think everybody would kind of agree that if Michigan really has any chance of competing in the Big Ten, you know, come December, one of the things that they're really going to have to do is they're going to have to find a way to get a lot less pressure on Warren and Ojai, because right now they're kind of in this two quarterback system where they're only really there in certain elements. But I think that defense really is going to have to kind of, the defense and being able to control the line of scrimmage and the tempo of the game is ultimately going to make or break how far they can really get in, and how far is it going to be, are they just kind of going to be in a top premier sort of bowl game, or can they kind of squeak into the playoff depending on a couple variables of conference championship games, or maybe a couple other top teams end up kind of falling out like we saw with Florida State. But the thing is too, it's going to be a fun matchup because, like I said before, Texas defensive line it is going to look a little bit different too. But when you have somebody like that, they can just plug in fourth and fifth senior year guys who have been kind of in the weights, or have transferred from other schools, and they're still going to, no matter where they kind of are in the process, they're going to be big up front. They're going to be tough. They're going to be intimidating. They're going to give them a lot of time. They're going to pressure them a lot and all that good stuff too. But I think the other element too is you have one of the best quarterbacks in the entire country in Quinn Ewers, who is hungry for a national championship. And I think if you ask me, Texas really does have all the weapons really necessary to make a deep, legitimate run too, because they do have some younger guys on the offensive side of the ball as well, who will be immediate playmakers and will be able to help Ewers and kind of those tougher situations too. But you know, like I said, I just can't really imagine this game kind of being a shootout. I sort of imagine this game saying to myself, if Texas can stop Michigan from running the ball, and Texas does what Texas does, I mean, to me, this should be a game where Texas should be able to win by, I would say at least two possessions, because I I obviously, you can only take a Fresno State game with a grain of salt, and I get that too. But in general, a lot of the things that we were talking about, back in July and early August, were the things that were prevalent as of now. So, it is a noon kickoff, which also is great too. And College Game Day is going to be there too, which I'll definitely be watching too. But when you have a team that has such a strong defense, really, no matter where in the time picture they are, and they did have some continuity there, and they do have all that stuff too. But really the reality is, you know, yes, Michigan tried to keep the continuity with Moore and all that stuff too, but you know, Donovan Edwards did average about 4.5 yards a carry versus Fresno State, and 8 of those 26 attempts for 2 yards or less. Who, you know, you don't really, no one sits there and says, oh yeah, Fresno State has a really strong defensive line and plays really good rush defense. So when you think about all those elements, and you think about Quinn Ewers, who is certainly going to be a Heisman Trophy candidate this coming fall, it definitely kind of asks a lot of questions. But I I do think that this is going to be fun because we don't get many of these strong Big Ten versus SEC matchups, and ultimately what it's going to come down to is to what extent can Michigan control the tempo of the game, and Quinn Quinn Ewers really just kind of take over and do exactly what we think is going to happen, which is going to be throwing dimes all over the field and causing a lot of confusion for a Michigan defense who definitely did look strong last year and has a lot of great playmakers who can stop the ball, but there's just too much on the offensive side of the ball, which strongly makes me believe that this is Texas's game